Okay, so it's not even 5 a.m. It's cold and it's rainy, and there are like 8,000 people in a field holding their phones up over a pile of rocks. And then the sun comes up right over this one stone and it lands dead in the center, and people lose their minds for like 3 seconds. And this event I'm talking about is called Stonehenge at the summer solstice. And it's genuinely an ancient thing and an actually very incredible event. But here is the thing: the holiday that all those people think they're celebrating, Litha, that is a word that literally means good weather for sailing. So it's actually, it came from a medieval monk, and then it was rebranded as a pagan Sabbath name by one guy in the 70s. So it's like, for real, the most wild game of telephone that spans over 1,300 years. And the sun part is ancient. The sun's been around forever, but like the whole branding of the summer solstice is actually younger than your parents. And I'm here to tell you why. So grab yourself a drink and let's get into it. Hi, I'm Heather, and this is Delusional Bitch Juice, the podcast where I get into the mysteries behind the metaphysics, the real facts behind folklore, and hidden truths that you should probably definitely know about and won't believe are real. So, the tarot card episode last week, in my opinion, was my best episode yet if I was trying to make a History Channel documentary. I got a little carried away with the intro music and the background noise and the sound effects, and I was just like really getting into it. But still, go listen to it. It's a great episode. I did a lot of research and learned a lot about tarot. So if you're interested in the real history behind tarot cards and where they came from, I definitely suggest listening to that one. But stick with me. We're getting better. I said I was a little rusty, and I might have gone too much the other way on the last episode. So hopefully this one's better. And third time's a charm, right? So I'm just going to be real with you on this one. So what is Litha, and why do we actually care about it? So let me start with the basics before I get into the juicy stuff for some of you who might not be familiar with the pagan Sabbath name. So Litha is the modern Wiccan and pagan name for the summer solstice, and it lands anywhere between June 20th and June 22nd. And I believe this year it's actually June 21st. And it marks the longest day of the year. And unfortunately, after the summer solstice, the days just keep getting shorter from here, which is crazy because here in the Midwest, it seems like we haven't even hit hell's front porch yet, but it's true, unfortunately. So Litha is considered a lesser Sabbath. It sits in between Beltane and Lammas, which is another Sabbath in the summer, but it sits in between those two on the wheel of the year. And it's basically right in the middle of the year. So we're over the hump, basically, and only like 132 days to Halloween. So that's great. But spiritually, Litha represents like the peak of the sun's power. And so what began anew at Imbolc and started to emerge at Ostera and came to life in Beltane is now in full activation mode. Like, it's peaking. And pagans love this because you can actually observe this powerful astronomical moment that, like, humanity has been tracking for thousands and thousands of years across every culture. And that's the real ancient part. But the name Litha is not as old as people think. It was actually popularized in 1974, and that's younger than most millennials' parents. So who actually gave it the name Litha? So there's a little debate in the pagan community about whether Gerald Gardner gave the summer solstice the name Litha, or if it was Aidan Kelly, who is credited for publishing it in The Green Egg. So I'm here to clear that up. So first of all, Gerald Gardner, he's the man who invented Wicca in the 1950s. He initially referred to the fire Sabbats as May Eve, August Eve, November Eve, and February Eve. Very, very creative names, I know. And he actually called his summer solstice midsummer, not Litha. So, contrary to popular belief, he actually suggested that the solar festivals, like the solstice, were added later and actually brought over from the Middle East. So, this man who literally invented Wicca wasn't even sure that the solstices had ancient pagan roots in the first place. So, that's interesting. Gardner built like the structure, but he didn't name the summer solstice. The name came from Aidan Kelly in 1974. And Aidan Kelly gave names to the solstices and equinox holidays like Litha, Ostara, and Mabon. And those gained traction when he published them in Tim Zell's Green Egg magazine, which at the time was like the lifeline to let other pagans connect with other pagans, and because it was like a reader attributed magazine, right? So people would write in and things like that. Like there was no internet, obviously, so there was no witch talk, no pagan section in Barnes and Noble. So think of the Green Egg magazine as like the witchy subreddit that you're probably on right now. So what actually happened then? Why did he come up with this name Litha? So Kelly was putting together a pagan craft calendar, so a calendar specifically for pagans. And it was the first of its kind, mind you. And while he was listing out all the pagan holidays, he looked at it and like literally got upset that the summer solstice and fall equinox did not have a like proper pagan sounding name. And Gerald Gardner's Midsummer and August Eve apparently weren't cutting it aesthetically, so he decided to fix that. And unlike Anthony Court de Jeblin, the guy who just made up the history of tarot cards and ran with it, Kelly actually did his research. He pulled the name Litha from the Saxon lunar solar calendar described by the Venerable Bede. And in Bede's calendar, the 6th and 7th months were actually called Forlia and Afterlia. And when a 13th month was added right in between them, that would have made it the Threlia. So, using the same logic as how, like, the Yule frames the winter solstice, Kelly reasoned that the summer solstice must have been called Litha. Fair enough, right? And fun little side note and fun fact, Tolkien actually independently came up with this same exact conclusion on his own, but that's an entirely different rabbit hole that I'm not going to go down tonight because we don't have time. But basically, Kelly published this updated Wheel of the Year with the new Sabbath names in that magazine, The Green Egg, and the pagan community ran with it. So here's the breakdown plainly, because I know that probably got a little muddied, but so the structure of the 8 Sabbats already existed. 4 of them, Samhain, which is Halloween, Beltane, and Lammas, already had names and rituals. And winter solstice already had a name too, Yule, obviously. So Kelly just filled in the 3 blanks that didn't have satisfying pagan names, and he did this using the oldest text he could find as his source, which honestly makes sense to me, because if you were going to name something and be intentional about it, you would go to the oldest reference. Fair, right? So, but here's what gets even like a little wild. So the calendar that Bede was referencing in his 725 AD work, The Reckoning of Time, that calendar was already outdated when he wrote it. So he was documenting a heathen Germanic calendar from memory, and one that had likely already been brought to England by the Anglo-Saxon settlers in like the 5th or 6th century, maybe earlier. We really don't know. But by the time Bede wrote it down, those names were already ancient and like out of use, out of date. So that's crazy. And even then, it wasn't they weren't even religious festival names. Bede wrote that Leah means calm or navigable because of the breezes that are gentle and the waters are usually easy to navigate. So he was like literally describing good sailing weather. The Old English term just meant it was boating season, point blank. And as for someone who is from the Midwest, it's basically the calendar telling us it's time to go to the lake for the weekends, which like kind of blows my mind. So to put a nice little bow on everything, there's no actual evidence that the Celts, Germans, or pre-Christian pagans held any kind of formal solstice rites under this name. Like, Litha doesn't appear in any Celtic or Irish mythology, or like the way Beltane and Samhain do. Like, and most modern pagans don't know that the name was like essentially invented in 1974 by one guy who had a new calendar project and a copy of Bede. But here's the thing. The name being modern doesn't make the moment like any less real. This is an astronomical event that was observed and celebrated across cultures all over the world, like long before anybody named it anything. And that's exactly what we're getting into next. So the oldest culture I can think of that gave a ton of meaning to the summer solstice were the Egyptians. And similar to Stonehenge, the Sphinx is strategically placed so that on the summer solstice in June, the sun sets between the two great pyramids of Khufu and Khafre. And the sun between the two pyramids is like literally makes a hieroglyph in the sky called a ket, which means place of becoming effective. So that's pretty deep. But so why did they do this? So for 5,000 plus years, the Nile flooded every summer like clockwork, like so reliably that an entire civilization built their calendar, their religion, their goddess mythology, their architectural alignments, and all around predicting when it was going to flood. Okay, that's how important it was. So the Nile flooded every single year around the same time, starting in June and receding in September. So it was literally a summer flood, but this flood wasn't like a natural disaster like it is here in the States. It was a predictable, like, life-giving event because it deposited rich black silt across the farmlands, helping the crops grow. And I've said this before, I don't care what culture you're from, like, agriculture was everything back then. So, of course, every culture needs a way to explain what's happening. So the Egyptians credited the rising of the Nile to the heliacal rising of Cyrus. And a heliacal rising is just when a star reappears on the horizon right before sunrise after being hidden by the sun's glare for a couple weeks. So Cyrus was considered like the Nile star or the star of Isis, and it reappeared at dawn on the summer solstice. And ancient Egyptian mythology actually linked Cyrus to the goddess Saptet. And it's told that the flooding of the Nile was due to the tears of Isis mourning the murder of her husband Osiris. Again, this is another episode for another time because I don't have time to get into like all of Egyptian mythology, but let me give you the short version. So Saptet was the personification of the star that rose on the dawn of the summer solstice. She was basically a cosmic alarm clock for the flood coming. And Isis was the grieving wife. She rises to find her dead husband Osiris, and her tears become the flood. So Cyrus, Isis, and Sabtet are all the same goddess, and that's all you need to know about that right now for this episode. Okay, now let me take you across the world to the Andes Mountains of Peru, where the Inca were also celebrating the solstice, but like for a completely different reason. Being in the southern hemisphere, June 24th was their winter solstice, like the shortest day of the year, the sun at its weakest. So while we're over here crowning flower queens and doing lake days, the Inca were looking up at the same sun and were genuinely panicking that it was leaving forever. So same sun, completely different vibes. So the Inti Raymi, the Festival of the Sun, that's what it was called, was established by Emperor Pakuchetek in the 15th century to honor the Inti, the sun god. And here's where it gets good. The Inca just didn't worship the sun. They, like, truly believed their emperor was literally the son of the sun, like, biologically the sun. And the origin story goes that the sun god, the Inti, looked down at humanity just, like, wandering around in all this chaos, being bad, and decided to send two of his actual children, Manco Capac and Mama Akol, down from the heavens to fix things. I'm just going to pause there and let you think of another religion that sounds similar. But anyway, so they emerged from Lake Titicaca carrying a golden staff with instructions to find a city wherever the staff sank into the ground. And my logic is saying that was probably because that meant good farmland, but it doesn't explicitly say that. That's just me. But so it sank into the valley of Cusco. And Manco Capac became the first emperor. And every Sapa Inca after him inherited that divine bloodline claim. So when the emperor showed up to Inti Raymi, he wasn't just a king like doing this little ceremony, right? He was literally the son of the sun, personally negotiating with his father not to abandon the world for the winter. It's pretty crazy. This ritual lasted like several days and started with all of the Inca nobility fasting. And at dawn, thousands of people packed like the main square of Cusco, waiting in silence basically for that first ray of sunlight to clear the mountains. And when it did, the Sapa Inca raised like this golden cup of chachi, which is like their sacred corn beer, and offered it to the sun. So the son of the sun offering a drink to his dad at sunrise in front of like 1,000 people every single year, that's like not just religion, that's like a power move. And if that wasn't enough, they also had like a literal leash for the sun, okay? So the Intihuanta stone at Machu Picchu, Inti meaning sun, Huanta meaning to tie up or hitching posts, translates directly to hitching post of the sun. Like, just like the pyramids or Stonehenge, it was a precision astronomical instrument that was placed intentionally for the summer solstice. And on the solstice, it casts its longest shadow, and on the equinox, it almost has no shadow at all. So it's basically another cosmic calendar carved into stone by people who had no reason to be good at this kind of astronomy, but were, basically. The sad thing is that the Spanish destroyed every one of these kinds of stones they could find when they arrived. The one at Machu Picchu only survived because, like, the whole site itself was hidden. And in 1535, the conquistadors actually banned Inti Raymi entirely because they labeled it as pagan idolism. And they melted down the golden sun disk and built a church on top of the foundation of the sun temple. And that's bad. But for nearly like 400 years, Inti Rami was still celebrated, but just in secret. And it was actually revived in 1944 and is now one of the largest festivals in South America. Like over 100,000 spectators go to Cusco on June 24th. If you want to go, I'll link it in the show notes. But it's truly a wild story of how they celebrated the solstice. And then there's the Slavic tradition of Cupola night, which also falls around the solstice, but I covered that in the very first episode, the Beltane episode, so go listen to that one, because I don't like repeating myself. But just know that that is also a summer solstice festival. Okay. Then, there's probably one of my favorite ways or cultures that, like, celebrate this. We cannot forget about Midsummer. So, some of you may have seen the movie. Some of that in the movie is real. The real stuff is technically weird enough that Ari Aster barely had to add anything. So hang with me here. So the Swedes treat Midsummer like we treat Christmas, okay? Cities completely empty out, everything closes down, everyone goes to the countryside. It's like a whole thing. There's flowers, there's a maypole, and there's even a mandatory skinny dip. Yes, I know, but we're gonna get into it, okay? So, the maypole. No one really knows the origin because, of course not. Why make it easy for me to research this? But it's most likely from Germanic paganism of the Iron Age and like early medieval cultures. No one, of course, no one really knows what it was made to represent. Some say it represented the axis of the world, which makes sense. Others speculate that it was the Germanic tree of worship. And most recently, people seem to think it's a phallic symbol, which like absolutely kills me. It could have also just genuinely been a pretty pole with ribbons that they danced around to celebrate summer. No crazy meanings or attachments, but the idea that the maypole was a phallic symbol was actually a 17th century rumor that the Puritans made up because they were mad that it was one of the pagan customs that actually survived Christianization. So the Puritans had to make it sexual so they can have a reason to get rid of it, right? They said dancing around the maypole led to drinking and other forms of merriment that were considered sinful. I don't know. It sounds like they were trying to say the maypole was a stripper pole, but I joke. Anyway, it was the scholar Ronald Hutton who actually came out and said, like, have you guys seen a dick before? There's absolutely no sign that people who use maypoles thought they were phallic, and they were never carved to appear so. I'm dead. Like, the Puritans really did everything they could to get this celebration banned, right? And the best reason they came up with was that it looked like a dick. I can't with the Puritans. But by the time the maypole was finally defended, it had already been banned. In 1644, the Puritans literally went to Parliament and demanded that it be prohibited due to its mixed-gendered dancing, drunkenness, and Sunday merrymaking, and that it represented heathenish vanity. So the Puritans really did not like the maypole. Like, it's just a bunch of people dancing with ribbons around a pole, wearing flower crowns, and that was, like, way too much for the Puritans. And Hutton's notes on the maypole actually concur with the Swedish scholar Carl Wilhelm von Sauden, who said that maypoles were simply erected, no pun intended, but they were erected as a sign of happiness and the season of warmth had returned, and the shape was literally just made and allowed for garlands of flowers to be hung from them. Like, duh. Like, how else are they gonna dance around a maypole and hang flower garlands? Like, it's just a pole. The Puritans, I feel like, were honestly just jealous that they weren't invited. But I digress. If we're talking Sweden specifically, they adopted their maypole tradition from Germany in the late Middle Ages, and they called it the Midsummer Stag, or the Midsummer Pole. The Swedes also turned it into a cross at one point to make it seem more like a religious thing and less like pagan-y and more acceptable to Christian society. But like, they knew what they were doing. And to make things even crazier, there's this like little song about frogs called Sam Gordon. And it's like a fun little folk song where everyone acts like frogs with no tails and jump around the maypole. Like everybody does this. It's not just for kids, like even the adults. And there's no real obvious reason why frogs would appear at a midsummer celebration, but they've been doing it forever and like for over a century, and no one questions it. And apparently that's just the Swedish way. So I'm not going to ask any further questions on it. Then there was the flower crowns. So the reason they wore flower crowns at the celebration is honestly a very simple one. Everything growing had special powers, and those powers were activated at midsummer. Like, duh. No further explanation needed. Flowers even had the power to tell you who you were going to marry. But here's the catch. To do this, you had to be single, obviously. And then you have to go out into the woods alone, like no buddy system. And you have to be super quiet. And then you have to pick 7 different kinds of wildflowers and put them under your pillow on midsummer night. And your future husband will come to you in your dreams. But the thing was, like, you had to be completely silent. Even if a tiny peep came from your mouth while doing this, the magic is gone, it's broken, no husband, and you would have to try again next year. Some religions say it was 9 flowers for no apparent reason. I couldn't find any resource or reliable resource that told me why. I don't know. Maybe they thought they needed 2 extra flowers just in case. I'm not sure. But there's that. And as if dancing around something the Christians considered phallic wasn't already enough, the Swedes end every midsummer night with a midnight skinny dip. And you've probably like heard of moon water, right? Same idea. Bathing in water, particularly water that contains the dew that has fallen on Midsummer Eve, was said to be unusually healthful. So, no body of water nearby? No problem. Some people would go as far as rolling around naked in dew-soaked grass just to make sure they soaked up the extra health and strength, right? They also would gather dew from as like a form of medicine because why not have a little bit to last you the rest of the year? But why skinny dipping specifically? Because the magic wouldn't work. It won't soak in if you're clothes. Like, obviously, duh, that's why they skinny dip. Now, here's where it gets even more unhinged. Swedish folklore simultaneously warned that a water spirit called the Knack, who was a seductive naked man playing the violin in the river, would specifically hang out on Midsummer Night, like hunting to lure people into the river so they would drown. And he would just like sit on a rock in the water, playing music that was so beautiful that you couldn't resist walking straight in and drowning. Which sounds like Siren to me, honestly, but same. But the Swedes decided to go skinny dipping anyway, despite a naked water demon. But respect, honestly. And as a fun little footnote, statistically, the highest number of Swedish babies are born around March 21st. That's 9 months after midsummer. So you can do the math yourself and take that as what it is. So basically, every culture understood the same thing about the solstice, even when they couldn't explain it. It isn't just a celebration, it's like also a warning. The longest day of the year also means that days start getting shorter from here. Like when the sun is at its most powerful, it's already beginning to leave. I hate to say it again, but one of the most beloved modern pagan stories about the summer solstice, it's beautiful, it's dramatic, it feels ancient, it feels Celtic, it feels like you would have found this carved into a stone somewhere in Ireland 1,000 years ago. But it was actually written in 1948 by a heartbroken British poet who was trying to process his feelings about a woman. So let me explain. The story goes like this. The year is divided between two kings. They're brothers and rivals, right? So the Oak King rules the waxing year from the winter solstice to the summer solstice. And he represents growth, light, warmth, and the sun climbing higher every day, right? So then there's his brother, the Holly King, who rules the waning year. So he rules from the summer solstice to the winter solstice. And he represents darkness, rest, introspection, and like the long slide back towards the cold, basically. At each solstice, they battle. Okay, so at midsummer, which is a couple days from now, the Oak King is at his absolute peak of power, and because of this, he wins. The days are longest, there's light everywhere, everything is in full bloom, and that's exactly when his brother, the Holly King, shows up and kills him. So, because in this myth, the peak is also the end, and the moment of greatest power is the exact moment the tides turn. So, the Holly King defeats his brother at the height of his glory, takes the throne, and begins his slow, long reign towards the winter. And then at Yule, winter solstice, the Oak King is reborn and comes back and does the same thing. He kills him. So, back and forth, they do this forever, and it's all for the love of a goddess, of course, who watches this whole thing from the sidelines and honestly seems like completely unbothered by it. But anyway, it's a truly beautiful story. It's a simple and beautiful story. But like I said, it's not as old as people think. So the sad thing is, just like Litha, there are zero and absolutely no references to the Oak King or the Holly King in any ancient Celtic or medieval manuscript. Not one. People often assume that it came from James Fraser's The Golden Bog, which was published in 1890 and is like a real academic piece of work on comparative mythology. But when you actually read The Golden Bog, the terms Oak King and Holly King appear exactly 0 times. So I don't know why people think that, but the story as we know it comes entirely from a book called The White Goddess, which was published in 1948 by a man named Robert Graves. So who was Graves? He was an English poet who served in World War I and survived the Somme, wrote a celebrated World War I memoir called Goodbye to All That, and also wrote I, Claudius, which is like actually a fantastic historical novel. But he was a professor of poetry at Oxford, and he published over like 1,200 poems in his entire lifetime. Like, this man was brilliant when it came to literary work. But the thing is, he was not a historian. And he said so himself. Like, Graves openly admitted that he was not a medieval historian, but a poet. And that The White Goddess was based on the premise that the language of poetic myth was a magical language, meaning he was doing a poetic interpretation, not academic research. And he wrote The White Goddess after or during World War II, after a dramatic breakup with his 14-year long-term girlfriend, who was the American poet Laura Whiting, who had left him and apparently was very judgmental of him and his work, like was always belittling him. And as a man who always worked best when he was in love, suddenly was very much not in love. And he sat down and wrote a book about how an all-powerful goddess who inspires and then destroys men. Makes sense. Like, scholars have basically unanimously agreed that the White Goddess is more poetry than history. Like, one classicist put it very bluntly. He said it was either the greatest contribution to mythology ever written or complete cranky nonsense, and that you would never find a classical scholar who thought it was the former. So they're pretty mean. But look, the nicest thing that anyone academically had to say about the White Goddess was that it was great poetry, terrible history. And Ronald Hutton, back who defended the maypole, who at this point should, like, honestly be a co-host on this episode, he confirmed that there is zero pre-modern evidence that the Oak King and Holly King ever appeared in British folklore. So Graves built the whole framework full stop, which tracks because the man himself was a poet, not a historian. And he said that out loud himself. We just chose to ignore it. So we have our second man making up something from his mind, but here's the thing. He wasn't making it up from nothing. The fragments he pulled from were real, like the Welsh battle myth, the medieval folk plays, even the Jesus and John the Baptist parallel, both born on the solstice, one waxing, one waning. That's actually like a wild observation when you think about it. Graves just connected the dots in his own way and gave everything names and a storyline, and Janet and Stuart Farrier carried that into Wicca in the late 1970s. So the rest is history, like literally ancient history. So before we get into actually how to celebrate Litha, I have to mention one more thing because it ties the whole thing together in a way that I find like genuinely hilarious. So the Catholic Church looked at the summer solstice, this ancient astronomical event that the Egyptians built pyramids around, that the Inca performed multi-day ceremonies for, that the Swedes went skinny dipping for, and they looked at it and said, cool, you can keep doing all this, but now it's for John the Baptist. So on June 24th is the feast of St. John the Baptist. It's his birthday. It's 3 days after the solstice. And this might sound familiar, and before you think that's a coincidence, Christmas is December 25th, which is 3 days after the winter solstice. And Easter was absorbed by the spring equinox. Like, the church has been doing this for centuries. And so it's kind of like if you can't beat the party, throw your own party on the same weekend and tell everyone it was yours first. That's what the church is doing. The wild thing is that John the Baptist placement actually makes theological sense if you look at it. John the Baptist said, I must decrease so that he may increase. And John is born at midsummer when the days start to get shorter. And Jesus is born at midwinter when the days start to get longer. So that's very interesting to me. So whether that was intentional calendar math or a very convenient coincidence, nobody fully agrees on. Yeah, it's just something interesting to think about. Was that the Oak King and the Holly King? Who knows? But the bottom line is that Litha, Midsummer, the Feast of St. John, Cupola Night, Inti Raymi, they're all pointing around the same moment, the same sun, the same term, which, however you choose to celebrate it, you're obviously in good company. Okay, so now for everyone that came specifically for the astrology and sat through me talking about a medieval monk and a heartbroken British poet and like a murderous Swedish river demon, your time has finally came. Welcome. Here's the astrology part, and I'm so glad you're here. So let's talk about what's actually happening in the sky right now, because honestly, the cosmos did not miss this year. So first, the basics. Every year at the summer solstice, the sun moves into Cancer. And before any Cancers in the audience get super excited, this is actually a weird placement when you think about it, because the sun is associated with active outward yang energy, and Cancer is ruled by the moon, which governs emotions, instinct, and your 2 a.m. notes in your iPhone. So what we have on the longest, brightest, most solar day of the entire year, and the sun walking into the most inward emotional lunar sign of the zodiac. So it's peak power and then immediately turns inward, which seems to be the theme of this whole episode. So that is like also so Cancer coded, honestly. And the word solstice itself actually comes from the Latin siester. I don't know. I don't know Latin. But it basically means the sun is standing still. So for about 3 days, the sun appears to just stop moving in the sky before it starts to retreat. So it's the most powerful moment of the solar year, but it's also a pause, a full stop, which is exactly what Cancer season is asking for. Slow down, go home, be in your feels, and eat something comforting. So, what is actually happening this year? So, now here's where 2026 specifically gets interesting because the sky has been building towards the solstice all month, and some of the biggest hits are still coming. So, June has been absolutely drenched in Cancer energy before the solstice even hits, right? So, Mercury moved into Cancer on June 1st, softening communication and cranking up the emotional sensitivity, basically making it impossible not to reach out to people and tell them exactly how you feel, whether you mean it or not. Then on June 9th, which is today, Venus and Jupiter form a conjunction in Cancer, meaning they were sitting right next to each other in the sky. Their energies are fully merged. So think of it as like two people showing up to the same party and deciding to like team up for a game of beer pong. And those two people are Venus, which is the planet of love and beauty, and Jupiter, which is the planet of luck and expansion. So that's like a really good beer pong team. But it's one of the like luckiest and most alignments of the year, like love, beauty, expansion, pleasure, all in the most nurturing and mothering zodiac. So by the time the solstice arrives on June 21st, the sun is walking into that same party that Venus and Jupiter and Mercury already started and have been there for a while. And then right after the solstice is when things start to get spicy. So on June 29th, that day is doing the most, right? Like Mercury goes into retrograde in Cancer. So meaning Mercury appears to move backwards in the sky from our perspective here on Earth. It's not like actually moving backwards, it's just like an optical illusion based on the speed difference between Mercury's orbit and ours. Sorry, just nerded out on you for a second, but think of it like you're on a faster train passing a slower one. Like for a moment, the other train looks like it's going reverse. That's what a retrograde is for any of you who didn't know. So you've probably heard of like when Mercury goes into retrograde, the areas that it governs, like communication, technology, travel, contacts, those all tend to get sluggish, delayed, or honestly just plain weird. And since this one is happening in Cancer, all of that backward energy is pointing directly at your emotional world. So for Virgos and Scorpios, we're going to absolutely hate this. But old conversations resurface, old feelings come back, people you haven't thought about in months suddenly reach out. It's a lot. Then Jupiter moves into Leo the very next day, shifting the whole energy toward creativity, self expression, and joy. So that's your green light. So, Litha 2026 specifically sits at this hinge point, right? The solstice is asking you to pause and go inward and figure out what you've been carrying and what needs to stay or go. And then, literally, the next week, the sky says, okay, you've done the inner work. Now go be magnificent. And that's a pretty good deal, honestly. So here's one thing worth sitting with. So Cancer is the sign of home, roots, ancestors, all that emotional energy, right? So the sun peaks and immediately asks you to go inward and like tend to what matters and to figure out what you want to carry into the second half of the year and what you have finally decided you're ready to put down. Then the solstice gives you permission to pause before the sprint. So use that pause to figure everything out before we go into Leo. And now finally, we have reached the point for all of you who actually want to know what to do on Litha and had to sit through not only the history but also the astronomy lesson. But I respect your patience and thank you so much for making it this far. This one is for you. And here is your low effort to high effort, basically menu per se of how to celebrate Litha. So starting with low effort, like minimum effort possible, just like Beltane, just go light something on fire responsibly. Like, a candle counts, and practice some gratitude when you do it. That's the simplest thing you can do. You can also float flowers in water with intention. Just get a glass bowl, snip some wildflowers, put them in the water. Done. You're celebrating Litha. Also, you could go outside during sunrise and sunset on June 21st with a purpose. Like, don't just go out there to take a photo for your story. Like, actually stand there and feel the sunrise and sunset. Like, the Egyptians built entire pyramid complexes to see what you're seeing for free. So just think about that. You could also do the whole, like, Swedish thing and put 7 wildflowers under your pillow, and you know what to do. Not don't talk while you pick them, obviously. And then also, my personal favorite, you can make sun tea. So, basically just leave a jar of water and some tea bags out in the sun for a few hours and then drink it, and that's it. That's the ritual. You're celebrating Litha. Now, if those seem a little too simple, here's some, like, medium effort things you can do. You can make a flower crown, which I personally like doing. Construction paper and faux flowers do count and are allowed if you're in a more urban area. Like, do not go out to a park and uproot natural landscaping for content. Like, I'm so serious. But you could also make garland from dried herbs and hang them, like, somewhere in your home. You can decorate your altar with fresh flowers, dried herbs, floating candles. You could also make a fairy house, which this has been on my mind honestly for the past few months, ever since Beltane. You can make a fairy house, or you can also get one off Amazon, but then leave an offering of, like, milk or honey or bread at the edge of your garden. In Germanic and Celtic folklore, midsummer is one of the times that the veil between the worlds is really thin, kind of similar to Samhain or Halloween. And that's when the Fae are most active. So, whether you believe that literally or not, it's a nice little excuse to leave something cute and pretty in your garden. Then there's, like, for the people who want to do the most, you can actually go visit Stonehenge. I'm not kidding. It still happens every year. Thousands of people show up for the solstice at sunrise. You would not be the weird one there. And then there are also some spells and rituals that you can dabble in if you feel so inclined. So, like, here are 3 of my favorite actual rituals you can do on Litha that are rooted in real folklore and practice, not just vibes, okay? So, the first one is sun water charging. Essentially, it's the solar version of moon water, which I know you already know how to do. So, leave a jar of spring water or any water outside in the sun from noon to the solstice. It's the peak of the sun's power. And you can add herbs like chamomile or calendula or St. John's wort, which all are historically harvested specifically on the solstice because they were considered to be the most potent at this exact moment of the year. And that part is actually grounded in real herbalism, by the way, not just folklore. But use the water to cleanse your altar, anoint candles. You could also bathe in it. In Germanic tradition, water collected at midsummer was considered protective and healing, which ties actually directly back to the Swedish skinny dipping thing that we talked about earlier. Like, same energy, less river demon. You could also do a intention fire ritual. So write down one thing that you want to release before the second half of the year. Write down one thing you want to call in, and then at sunset, burn the release paper in, like, a candle or flame or fire pit and let the sun take it, basically, as it goes. And then keep the intention paper, the one that you want to call in, on your altar until Lammas, which I'm obviously going to do an episode about. And this also is rooted in actual folklore magic logic of the solstice at the turning point. Midsummer fire traditions across Germanic, Slavic, and Celtic cultures all used fire as a cleansing ritual and a, like, petitioning tool to call in things they wanted for the second half of the year. It also lines up perfectly with the astrology is doing right now. Like, we literally just talked about the Capricorn full moon acting as a mid-year checkpoint. and the universe and the folk magic are like telling you the same thing. So take stock, decide what's coming with you into that second half of the year and what you're leaving behind. And then the final ritual, which is like honestly the most involved but most meaningful if ancestral practice is your thing. Harvest or purchase herbs that are specifically associated with midsummer. So St. John's wort, mugwort, chamomile, lavender, or yarrow are all traditional midsummer herbs. Dry them, braid them, or bundle them, whatever feels right. In Germanic folklore, herbs harvested at midsummer, again, were considered to have peak protective power and healing power, and were stored to use throughout the rest of the year as medicine and both in magic rituals. So you could leave a small bundle as an offering on your ancestral altar. You could leave it at the base of a tree, whatever feels appropriate for your practice. And pair it with a moment of acknowledgement for people in your lineage who framed how you celebrate things. Like, so it was people who watched the stars, farmed, who built their entire lives around knowing when the seasons turned. Like, you don't need a formal ritual for this. It's just a moment of recognition for our ancestors. And if you have a particular interest in Frigg, midsummer is a natural time to acknowledge her as the goddess of domestic arts, the hearth, the harvest cycle, and the abundance of this season. That all falls squarely in her domain. So, like a simple offering, a candle, a few words, like Frigg's been here for longer than the name Litha has. So honestly, the takeaway from all this is that, like, you don't need a, like, 5,000-year-old grammary to celebrate Litha correctly. As long as the intent is there, you're doing it right, okay? The oldest confirmed solar observatory built specifically to track the summer solstice is Nabata Playa in Egypt, and it was constructed around 5000 BC, making it about 1,000 years older than Stonehenge. So humans have been stopping to notice the summer solstice for at least 7,000 years, probably longer. So you're not doing anything wrong by lighting a candle and going outside. You're just doing exactly what humans have always done. So the sun has been there forever. It like really doesn't care what you call the holiday. As always, thank you so much for being here. I put a lot of time and effort into this season's episodes, and this one's especially where we went from everywhere from ancient Egypt to like a murderous Swedish river demon, and I genuinely had the best time researching all of it. All resources for this episode are going to be linked in the show notes, including everything we talked about from beads, text, to Ronald Hutton, to the astrology sources. Go check them out. I always encourage people to do their own research and come to your own conclusions. That's kind of the point of this whole podcast. Now, if you liked this episode, please subscribe, download, stream, and share. I know sharing what podcast you listen to is a very personal thing. Like, nobody wants to be judged for their taste. But it's genuinely the biggest way that you can help me get exposure for this new season, and sharing means more than. And if you want to see my facial expressions while explaining Litha was named by one guy from 1974 who was annoyed about his calendar aesthetic, I promise you it makes this episode at least 10 times funnier. So come watch on YouTube, follow and subscribe to the pod on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. All the links are below, and I will catch you next time for more hidden truths, metaphysical mysteries, and folklore facts. Thanks. Bye.